You alluded to this earlier, but what I wanted to say is one thing I've always appreciated about Jimmy Page as the band's producer was his appreciation for what the others brought to the table and his willingness from a production standpoint to make sure everyone got their chance to shine. You hear these stories about Mick and Keith muscling Brian Jones out of the band, famously about Lennon and McCartney keeping George Harrison down, all the inner band politics crap that went on. So it's nice to see that from day one. I mean, Zeppelin 1, there wasn't any jockeying for position. Everyone knew their role in the band. Everyone excelled, in that supportive climate. And one point I wanted to make that people may not realize is when the band was formed in '68, Robert Plant and John Bonham were 20 years old.
Right.
John Paul Jones was 22, and Jimmy Page was the old man in the group at 24.
Right.
These were young guys. I mean, Page and Jones had been doing a lot of studio work, as we said. So they were young, but they were experienced. Plant and Bonham were sort of like raw talents who appreciated hooking up with these guys who not only were good players and good guys, but knew how to work a studio and brought that to it. This is the spot where I was going to tell the Train Kept a Rolling story, but now I don't have to. Jimmy Page's guitar work, because you mentioned different people's criticisms. I knew a lot of guitar players who criticized Jimmy for being sloppy sometimes, occasionally even out of tune, either with the other instruments or even with himself. But Jimmy's solos always had character. And that seemed more important to him than technical perfection, And he did a lot of solos that were very precise and on pitch and classic, case in point, Stairway to Heaven, and which apparently he picked up a Telecaster and improvised that in one shot. So Jimmy Page haters, let me see you do that.
Yeah.
And his songwriting skills were unbelievable and musically imaginative. We mentioned Song Remains the Same. We mentioned 10 Years Gone. Who picks up a guitar and writes that besides Jimmy Page? I mean, bands like Black Sabbath and AC/DC, they can come up with the distorted riffs and the power chords, but where's their Rain song, what are your favorite observations about Jimmy Page? We spoke about him, but along the lines of what I'm talking about.
Well, you mentioned earlier he was sort of your guy, in the band. That's why a little disappointment into the Outdoor and less Jimmy. I was a Jimmy Page fanatic. I mean, it was over the top. And what stands out to me about Jimmy Page is he's a triple threat in music. He is a great guitar player, one of the greats. He's also a composer, one of the greats. And he's also a producer, one of the greats. And he was innovative in all three of those, and he was excelled at all three of them. When you take the big triumvirate of great guitar players that came out of the Yardbirds with Clapton and then Beck and then Page, the thing that separates Jimmy from Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck is the fact that those guys didn't really do a whole lot of writing, and I'm not familiar with whether they ever did any producing, but Jimmy Page excelled at all three from day one with Zeppelin, so he stood above the others in that regard. So that's one thing about him. The fact that he had such breeding in so many years in the studios and all the contributions. I mean, they've estimated that he was on, some extreme estimates say anywhere from 50 to 90% of all the recordings that came out of England during that period, from like 63 to 68. That's obviously hyperbole, but it was a huge amount. And he's had his fingerprint on the history of rock from beginning almost to end to this date. It's just extraordinary how much influence he's had. And I would think that he could be easily said to be possibly the most influential musician in the history of rock in some ways because of that, certainly up there.
Did you ever see Jimmy perform live?
Only once. It was the Arms Tour. I don't know if you saw that in 1983. It was for Ronnie Lane. What was the Affliction?
Hey, dude, I've got it all written down right here because the only time I saw Jimmy Page was Arms concert, Cow Palace in San Francisco.
We were at the same gig.
That's what I just realized.
You were in the area then? Did you live there?
I lived in Sacramento. I had a guitar student who said if I would give him a ride to San Francisco, he would give me a ticket to the Arms concert. And, it was Ronnie Lane had... from the Small Faces, he had multiple sclerosis. His girlfriend arranged this concert. And here's the thing, man. On stage, you had Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Paul Rogers from Bad Company, Joe Cocker, Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, Ron Wood from the Rolling Stones, Simon Phillips, Jimmy Page, and an all-star lineup. To give you an example, Carlos Santana was sitting 2 rows in front of me in the audience. He wasn't even in the show. He was in the audience. That's how star-studded that gig was.
Yeah, that's
so
amazing you were at that.
Yeah, tell me if you remember this. Do you remember Jimmy's chipped tooth?
No, I don't. No.
Yeah, because what I did is I muscled my way up to the front. By the time they were all jamming together on the stage at the end, I was right up front. And yeah, he had a chipped tooth, which was very noticeable. And I remember when he spoke on the microphone, he spoke so softly that no one could understand him.
I do remember that. Yeah.
You do remember that? Yes, right. To speak up. He was like practically whispering. But yeah, that's so funny that you never saw Zeppelin, but you saw Jimmy Page, and it was the same gig I was at. Man, that's hilarious. We are totally on parallel trajectories here.
I had no idea you were at that. Interestingly, my friend John is the one who lent me his physical graffiti album. He and I went to that concert together. So. Amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. And I know Jimmy Page had hardly touched a guitar for 2 years at that point.
He came out and he played, I think, something from a Death Wish soundtrack, a Chopin-based instrumental.
Yeah.
I remember he kind of came out and kind of did an instrumental of Chopin Prelude that he had done for Death Wish. And I can't remember what else he played, but I remember he played an instrumental version of Stairway to Heaven. Yeah. He just played it. And then at the end of the jam out in A minor, Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton appeared. And that's the part where I was up front for.
Yeah, it's pretty much historically stated that, and this is not a knock on any of these other extraordinary, legendary musicians, but Jimmy Page's appearance was the one that got the most excitement out of the crowd. But, Zeppelin had broken up at the end of 1980. Here it was a couple of years later, and he'd been basically completely inactive. He hadn't hardly touched a guitar. I think it was a sigh of relief from a lot of fans that he was at least doing anything.
Well, I got to say, Jeff Beck was on stage with him, and Jeff Beck did his set with Simon Phillips and Tony Hymas, and he was on his game because he had been playing his guitar. But you could tell he was like a little envious of the response to Jimmy Page. Now, Jimmy Page had not been around for a while too, and hadn't really been seen. But even if that wasn't the case, I mean, Jeff Beck might be arguably technically a better guitar player, but he wasn't, like you pointed out, wasn't really a writer. Wasn't really a producer. And again, not to take anything away from Jeff Beck. I love Jeff Beck. But you could tell the audience just loved having Jimmy there. It wasn't even what he was doing at the moment. He could have been out of tune and drunk or something. Just having his physical presence in the building and everybody having there's that word again, presence. Just having an opportunity for the outpouring of love for what he had already done. I think that's what that was about. That's the reason I drove that kid to San Francisco to see Jimmy Page. It wasn't really to see the other guys, Joe Cocker, or any other guy. I mean, no disrespect. I mean, all those people I mentioned are legends, Yeah. I actually thought Billy Preston was there, and so I actually looked it up, and I realized Billy Preston wasn't. But the reason I thought that is because they did do "You Are So Beautiful," but Joe Cocker sang it. So,
gotcha.
Which makes sense. And Paul Rogers sang something. It was just incredible lineup. I mean, it was like a once in a lifetime thing. So there's Jimmy Page. So let's talk a little bit about the other guys. John Paul Jones. As great a bass player as he is, I mostly think of him as a keyboard player because it's No Quarter and Since I've Been Loving You. Two of my Down by the Seaside, 3 of my very favorite Zeppelin tracks. And his keyboard playing is, such an important component of that. He made some noteworthy writing contributions here and there, and of course he had to, very competently double anything Jimmy Page did on guitar. He had to do on those 4 heavy strings. And also, as you point out in your book, he was really the only one of the 4 of them who had a formal musical education. So he brought that too, scoring, arranging, and so, what are your thoughts on John Paul Jones, who wasn't at the Arms concert, damn it?
Yeah, John Paul Jones is, I didn't originate this term, but a lot of people feel this way. He was the secret weapon for Zeppelin. What he brought to that band is what made them different from all other so-called hard rock bands, because he brought so much excessive talent and experience. As you said, a bass player and keyboard player. He excelled at both. He also could compose a lot of great music, contribute a lot to the compositions. In fact, he has said in more recent years that he and Bonham contributed a lot more compositionally than they were credited for. But it's also, as you mentioned, the fact that he was trained in scoring music and conducting music in orchestral scores. He did a lot of that as part of the session work he did in the 60s included that. He scored the strings on She's a Rainbow on the Rolling Stones' Satanic Majesties album. He was an exceptional and is an exceptional talent. And bringing all of that talent in there, they would not have had the string section on Friends from the third album. They would not have had the brass and strings on Kashmir without him. Listen to that. You made reference to it earlier. With All My Love on Into the Outdoor, that middle section keyboard part was very classically oriented. It's just beautiful. And, to bring that element to Zeppelin gave them that little extra edge of sophistication that's lacking in virtually any other band that you might consider a hard rock band. So John Paul Jones, they really, really were so blessed to get him.
I completely agree with everything you said. So Robert Plant, the front man and voice of the band, also their primary lyricist, and they definitely would have been a much different band with anyone else serving in that capacity. And you mentioned in the book, when you're looking at his stage moves and his voice, don't overlook his harmonica playing. On the recordings, he had some great moments, particularly in the early going on the harmonica. And he might have had the toughest job in the band, because as you point out, even in the early days, rock and roll, he's singing in one key in the studio and he's singing an octave lower live, because it's demanding to be the voice of the band, particularly in a band like that where he's giving himself a vocal workout. So what are your comments about Plant?
I have to say that Robert Plant deserves to be considered in the top maybe 3 rock vocalists of all time, in my opinion. Right up there with the Paul Rodgers, the Freddie Mercurys. People could even say Lennon and McCartney individually, some of the greatest vocalists in rock. But it's not just the quality of voice, which is extraordinary, the amazing range that he had, even though he felt that he's often embarrassed about his singing in the earlier years. In more recent years, he's talked that way. But, hey, if you're going to start off and be that good and then get better, then what does that tell you? But his stage presence, the what he put across there, just everything about it was extraordinary. And the live performances, he was an equal with the other 3, even though he was a vocalist. When it comes to the onstage improvisation, for which they were so well known, he held his own. I mean, he had an endless amount of phrases and lyrics that he could throw in there, or just sing lyrics from other songs, or quote his own lyrics from other Zeppelin songs, and the guitar and voice duels with Jimmy Page that they would go into. I mean, he really added a lot as a vocalist beyond just singing his own lyrics.
Very true. I agree with all that, and as demonstrated in that movie, when the extended sections, many cases of him just sort of trading off with Page, and they were very comfortable doing it. So yeah, an unusual attribute that a lot of other bands either couldn't do or didn't think to do. Frankly, yeah. I think Ella Fitzgerald said the reason she got into scat singing is the other horn players in the horn players in the big bands were doing all these soloing, and she just wanted to get on the action and solo too, and that was her instrument. So similar idea.
Yeah, she wanted to get her part in there. I don't blame her.
Yeah, and she excelled at it. Amazing. So finally, John Bonham, one of the most respected and influential percussionists of all time. Most people associate him with power. He was a very powerful player, but he really knew how to serve a song too. A perfect example, Stairway to Heaven. He doesn't even come in till the thing's halfway over, and when he does, he lays back on his ride cymbal and doesn't try and overtake the song. So we mentioned, Jimmy Page using restraint. There are plenty of examples of Bonham also playing with subtlety and restraint if he felt that's what, the composition required. And I have a feeling he didn't need Jimmy Page or Robert Plant to tell him that. I have a feeling he just intuitively knew. So what are your favorite aspects of Bonham's contribution to the band?
What I love about John Bonham is that even though he is recognized as perhaps the greatest rock drummer of all time, he grew up listening to Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich. So he had a jazz background. He understood the subtleties of jazz and swing and all of that. It was just inherent to him because that's what he learned. So he brought that, and that was actually fairly common with all the great drummers that came out of the late 60s, is that background, because that's what they knew. The idea of a rock drummer was a relatively new thing. Most of these guys, when they were young in the 50s growing up, it would have been jazz drummers they would have been hearing and learning from. So that influence is what helped bring in that ability to, as you said, serve the song the way he did, to know where to be restrained, where to be heavier. He plays with brushes a little bit on this Rain song. he brings a lot more than just a heavy beat. He also mentioned one time in an interview that as he progressed in his career with Zeppelin, he used to just really play hard, swinging the arms and everything. He learned how to have less movement and more supple wrist work, which is, again, a jazz kind of influence, and be able to hit just as hard or harder without as much exertion, which he would obviously need when they were playing 3 to 3.5 hours every night. So he had a lot more to offer than just heavy beats.
It's interesting because when you said that, it made me think that people of his age, they couldn't have grown up with rock because it wasn't invented yet. So, Ginger Baker, he thought of himself as a jazz drummer. Mitch Mitchell, he played like a jazz drummer. So, Bonham's contemporaries in England and in the other great bands, Cream, Jimi Hendrix Experience, Led Zeppelin, you're right. That's an excellent insight. These dudes were playing rock, but they learned jazz, and that's why they did inventive things on the instrument. Well, of course, the death of John Bonham was, maybe apart from forming the band, itself, that was the most significant and pivotal moment in the band's history, the loss of him. A lot of people have, asked the band about their quote unquote decision, whether or not to carry on. And Jimmy Page's position wasn't about making a decision. He goes, without Bonham, there's no Led Zeppelin, period, game over. He's irreplaceable. Without those 4 particular guys, it just didn't work. I think a lot of people respected them for not trying to carry on with a different drummer. I mean, look at the Doors. After Jim Morrison died, they recorded 2 more albums that no one cared about, and they're long forgotten because without Morrison, it wasn't the Doors. I know a lot of people who feel, for all practical purposes, The Who ended when Keith Moon died. What if Geddy, Alex, or Neil from Rush died? Could there still be Rush? One of the great things about music is how it highlights the value of the individual. You only get one Stevie Wonder. You only get one Bob Marley. You only get one Jimi Hendrix, one George Gershwin, one Beethoven. That's the cool thing about music. Maybe with an orchestra, you can take out the bassoonist, put in another bassoonist, and it still sounds like an orchestra. But in the music we all like, not so. Well, as you point out in your book, they were very versatile. They did a lot of things well. They could go electric, they could go acoustic, they could go hard, they could go soft. Sadly, playing with dynamics has become something of a lost art. In your chapter on dynamics, you grab how many more times and discuss in detail all the dynamical elements of that. But as a guy who spends time these days in recording studios, if you look at the waveform of a song, they're just like solid blocks. It's like a city with skyscrapers where they're all the same height. Everything's up full blast. Everything's mixed for computer speakers and earbuds. And it's just a different time. And I mentioned the Doors. The Doors and Led Zeppelin, in my own musical education, are probably the 2 bands that taught me the value of bringing it up, but bringing it back down, And also tempo is another thing you talked about. Not only did Zeppelin use a lot of different tempos, not just rhythms, like a Latin rhythm or tempos, a fast song, a slow song, a medium song, pacing. But not only did they vary it from song to song, but unlike many other bands, they would vary the tempo within the same song. And I think back on the Lemon song, the rhythm's doom, 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 doom. Then the solo comes, dun, 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 dun. They're racing down the road, then boom, boom, back to the other rhythm. Down by the Seaside, another example, it picks up, it drops back down. You mentioned that the band would routinely do 3.5-hour live shows with no opening act. Was this due to a reluctance to drop material? As new albums would come out, they'd want to add stuff to the show, but they didn't want to take anything out. So do you think the shows got so long for that reason? They just couldn't find it in themselves to drop certain things? Or do you think there was another reason?
There's a whole multiplicity of reasons. Yeah, that's one of them. They found that they're obviously going to drop some material as they progress through their career in the 70s as the new albums come out. But they also felt there were so many of them that were just too important. They didn't want to drop them, so the shows just started getting longer. There's also the fact that the improvisation would just be such a big part of the show that it would extend songs out. No Quarter, you mentioned how much you love No Quarter. The studio version is just around 7 minutes, just under 7 minutes. Immediately on the first tour they're playing that in 73, it's already 12, 14, 15 minutes long. They were a band that was restless live, and they weren't going to just play the songs note for note like the studio albums, because what's the point? I mean, you might as well just buy the album instead of spending the amount of money to go see them. And that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean by that. Partly that, it was the improvisation. It was not wanting to drop too many of the songs, wanted to retain some of them. It was also because Jimmy Page has said this in some interviews that he had gone to see bands that he'd looked forward to seeing for years and years and years. Finally see them, and they might play an hour and 15 minutes, and the disappointment of that, he wanted to make sure the fans got their money's worth.
Okay.
All of these things played into it, and there's probably more that's not coming to mind, but it got to be 3 to 3.5 hours and 75, 77 tours. And there's, as you said, there was no opening act, and there was no intermission. So, yeah. I mean, that's commitment. Some people might say it's too long, but at the least you could say is, hey, these guys are committed.
They were working up there, too. They weren't phoning in any of those songs. I mean, that whole 3 hours, John Bonham was working, Robert Plant was working, and everybody knows Jimmy Page didn't stand still. I mean, big part of his trip was all of his rock star stage moves. Yep. And you can't even say John Paul Jones. He might have been the less demonstrative, just like John Entwistle was the less demonstrative, but he was playing his ass off, too. So, and one great thing about your book, you included some sample set lists from various stages of their career, and you could see what songs got added, what songs got dropped. And you had like some of the very earliest ones, 68, when they're basically the new Yardbirds, all the way up to the end. And it wasn't comprehensive, every single one, but representative to kind of see how the show developed. And, we've talked in a lot of generalities. I want to talk about some specific little quirks of this band. Sure. They had a strange tendency to purposely and intentionally lose a beat every now and then. But, for example, in the riff in The Ocean, most bands would play it like, doon doon doo doo doo. Do 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 do. Like that. They go do 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 do, and they lose a beat. And you mentioned progressive rock. Those guys did it differently. I mean, likewise on the turnaround, Black Dog, da 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 da. There's a missing beat in there. They said they originally did that as a joke, and they were like laughing their asses off at the absurdity of playing it that way. Yeah. But after a while, it just became how it went to them. It wasn't a joke anymore. It's just how it went. And speaking of comedy, another trend I've noticed in the band is toward what I would call the unfunny joke. One example being Jamaica. This was a joke that went, my wife and I went on holiday. Jamaica? No, she went of her own accord. Right. So Jamaica is being misheard as did you make her? Ha ha. Not a really amazing joke to begin with. So by calling the song Jamaica, they're offering you a punchline with no setup. It's like hearing somebody say to get to the other side without why did the chicken cross the road? So, when all the Americans were calling this song Dire Maker, what do they expect? We don't know. They're bad English puns, And the rhythm for the crunge was another sort of musical joke. Once all the, keyboard horn parts come in, you're right, it's the James Brown thing. But the original idea is, wouldn't it be funny to play a beat no one can dance to? Yeah. Well, that's why it keeps awkwardly starting and stopping. There's a little hesitation in there. So if a dancer was trying to get a handle on it, they look kind of, jerky and spastic. But again, who got the joke? Pretty much nobody. There's the song Hot Dog. Hey, look at us. We're goofing on country music. Isn't that funny? Not really. At least not as funny as you guys think, And as you said, even the band name is meant to be a joke. The whole idea being a Zeppelin is supposed to be lighter than air. So a Zeppelin made of lead literally can't fly. It means a failure. But again, how many people really got the joke? Most people just think it's a cool name because it has a Z in it and they have cool lettering. But now that I've kind of ripped on them, one little bit of comedy that I heard from a friend who did see them in concert, he told me about this. On the live version of Stairway to Heaven, Robert Plant sings, it's whispered that soon, if we all call the tune, then the piper will lead us to reason, and a new day will dawn for those who stand long, and the forest will echo with laughter. And then he says, does anybody remember laughter? And the audience cheers. Well, my friend saw him in concert. He got to that point. He goes, the new day will dawn for those who stand long. Forest will echo with laughter. Does anybody remember forests? That's pretty funny,
Well, I'm glad you're bringing this up because Zeppelin doesn't get recognized as having the kind of humor that they did. But you rightly point out that it's very British humor. And we Americans, I can't speak for you, but I certainly didn't get a lot of that kind of stuff at all. I didn't realize the British humor is its own unique thing. I mean, certainly I saw Monty Python and I loved it, but I didn't comprehend this uniqueness of British humor. And to name your band Led Zeppelin, it's kind of absurd and it's intended to be kind of funny. But like you said, most people don't know that, and the same thing with the songs you mentioned. Is it's a very unique sort of British thing. You get the same thing with a lot of the early Genesis. Peter Gabriel's Britishisms are unique that to this day I still learn. Oh, that's what that means. That's a British thing. I didn't, So most of my favorite bands are in fact British overwhelmingly, and so I get exposed to a lot of that stuff and have no idea what the background is until you read about it or whatever.
But, I got Monty Python. I got a lot of the Beatles jokes. George Harrison said that, Polythene Pam was supposed to be really funny. She looks like a man, da-da-da-da-da. He said, but it's Liverpudlian humor. It's like he said, a lot of people weren't laughing. They didn't really get the joke that was hilarious to them. So, right. Sometimes it gets lost in translation. But we can't go into every aspect of your 400-page book. But, some other specifics. You did a chapter on artistic integrity. Because, again, this is, as you said, inspiration, information, implementation. Zeppelin was in this situation where they sort of came to a halt, quote unquote, at the top of their game. One thing that's unique about them is licensing their music is rare. Putting themselves on iTunes was slow going. Like, they're in a powerful position. They don't have to just act desperate, acquiesce. And you indicate, and when I think about it, you're right. You can really only cite 3 instances of actual Led Zeppelin music appearing in a film. 2 of them involving Cameron Crowe, who's a personal friend of theirs, being Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Almost Famous. And the other one being Richard Linklater's School of Rock, starring Jack Black, in which they did this big elaborate plea to Led Zeppelin to let them use. They ended up giving him Immigrant Song. The ironic thing about that is they had previously denied Linklater the use of their music in a film called Dazed and Confused. Come on, man. Yeah. What would have been the harm in featuring Led Zeppelin music in a film about 1976 high school graduates? It was only going to add authenticity, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad he used that title because at least it got the point in there, about the Zeppelin, the omnipresence of Zeppelin at the time. They refused to give the permission, and I applaud them for that because I think a lot of people, if they heard me talk about this too much, would think I'm too highbrow and snobby about it, and maybe I am. But to me, this is the greatest rock band of all time. I would say that. I compare and talk a little bit about comparing them with the Beatles in the preface of the book, and how that's going to be an issue for a lot of people, but when you're talking about the greatest rock band of all time, in my opinion, I don't want to see, certainly personally, their stuff being used to sell soap or something. It sickens me.
Any music I like, I don't want to see in an advertisement. I heard Stevie Wonder's "You're the Sunshine of My Life" selling orange juice. The Beach Boys were selling Sunkissed or some kind of orange soda. And it just bothers me in general because to me, the music means more than just a commercial product. And it's not a highbrow thing. I think it's an emotional response. Is like it cheapens the art that we love. Yes. If somebody's going to use a Pink Floyd song, to sell me like a hammer or something, like, dun, 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 by our hammers, that ties in with Pink Floyd.
Yeah, I agree with you. With you. I hate it. And, hey, I'll put it this way. If a band or artist that did not achieve anywhere near the success and the money decides to let that happen, or perhaps doesn't have control over it anymore, but maybe gets a little bit of remuneration out of it, then I'm not going to begrudge them that, make your money. But when it comes to Zeppelin, and they have, as you said earlier, they have that control. They can say yes or they can say no. The longer they say no, the more I appreciate it. And they've slipped up a little bit.
Right. Inexplicably, they licensed the song Rock and Roll to Cadillac, which was a big deal. The rock and roll commercial for Cadillac. And we're all scratching our head trying to think, why did they do it? Is it somebody's personal favor behind the scenes? Or is they didn't need the money? They didn't need the exposure. Maybe they just like Cadillacs. I'm sure they got a big old check for it. Yeah. I don't know how many people said, I'm going to go buy a Cadillac because Led Zeppelin music is in the commercial. So it reminds me of the situation, to bring it back to the Doors. They licensed Light My Fire to Buick. Come on, Buick, light my fire, without Jim Morrison's knowledge. And that created a rift in the band that they never recovered from. Apparently from that point forward, Morrison just thought of the other 3 guys as co-workers instead of, true seekers of enlightenment through art, which is what the Break On Through was supposed to be about. We're going to use our music to break on through to another, mental plane or something. Now our music is selling Buick. Are you kidding me? So that was the example of that.
Well, you're hearing it so much with the classic rock bands of the 60s and 70s because I did point out in the book, I think one of the reasons we're seeing so much of this type of stuff in various ways is because a lot of those teenagers that were into those bands are now adults working in the various industries, and they're probably calling back to their childhood and so forth. And hey, if it's helping sales, whatever, but it does. It bothers me a lot, and I'm just pleased that Zeppelin, for the most part, held out on that.
No, that's a great point that, that was that generation. It's kind of like Judd Apatow, the music he chooses for his projects is based on the music he grew up with. And, that's why I recommend this book to people because like you pointed out in that chapter we're talking about right now, that 70s show did one season where every episode of the 25 episodes of the season was a Led Zeppelin title. That's awesome. I'd never really seen that 70s show. I didn't know any about that. He said News Radio, you mentioned. There are different appearances of it that I didn't know about. So it was interesting for me to hear about it. When WKRP mentioned dogs off Pink Floyd Animals, that whole culture, the Pink Floyd Animals culture goes, oh my God, did that just happen on a network TV show? They're not, like you mentioned, the mystique and the inaccessibility and keeping a low profile. Zeppelin, you wouldn't think they'd be on a show, but all this time passes and things change. Well, I kind of want to wrap this up here by having you speculate on a premise for me. Let's say, speculatively, that John Bonham did not die in 1980. Let's say he's still alive today, along with the other three band members. First question is, do you think they would still exist as a band, like the Stones and the Who more or less do? Or do you think they would have eventually broken up like the Beatles and Pink Floyd?
Obviously, as you say, it's speculation. I have to say, I think that they might not have made it through the 80s for a couple of reasons. One, because the 80s was the 80s. I did not like much of the music of the 80s personally. I don't mean to offend any of the listeners if they liked it. It was just my personal thing. It didn't do much for me. And I don't know, it was a very different scene than musically, the approach, everything about it, the sounds. But really the core reason would likely have been the fact that when Into the Outdoor was done as more of a Plant Jones album, and song like All My Love, as you made reference earlier, is on that, Page was not very fond of the song. It was too traditionally commercial for him. He's even said he could just see if they played it live, the audience doing their arm wave back and forth thing that just makes me grimace every time I see that. But that Jones and Plant clearly wanted to continue to progress more and more to other things, whereas Page has said multiple times subsequent to Zeppelin's demise that he and Bonham had been talking a lot about the next album after Into the Outdoor. They'd want to go and do a much heavier kind of thing, and I can really see a clash would have ended up happening, dividing the band interestingly between Plant and Jones and Page and Bonham. And I got a feeling it might have spelled the end of the group, which is hard for me to comprehend, but it could very well have happened. So they might not have made it anyway.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. John Bonham was not going to have drum machines on any Led Zeppelin album. That was one of the prevalent things about the 80s was drum machines. John Bonham wasn't needing that. Well, Jimmy Page knew that All My Love was about Robert Plant's son. And that's why he kept quiet and he let the song develop and go out as it was. And he didn't say a word about it because it was a heartfelt tribute from, it was because of that, that he sort of sucked it up. And I think the only problem is kind of the chorus. I think that the verses have that Robert Plant poetry, about feathers in the wind. The music is cool, no problem with the music. It's just the chorus is a little bit corny if you don't know that it's about his, his poor young deceased son, which people don't know. I didn't know. Dilla's explained to you. So, if they continued releasing albums in the 80s, they would have had two ways to go. They could have tried to adapt. Rush kind of went off the tracks a little bit, trying to sound like the Police and different things. Yeah. As you pointed out, John Paul Jones had thrown a bunch of synthesizers on In Through the Outdoor. That's what the 80s was about, synthesizers. I've kind of personally believe that the inner politics was going to be such that they're going to go, look, we're Led Zeppelin. We don't have to worry about what Cyndi Lauper is doing and Duran Duran. We're freaking Led Zeppelin. Play anything we want. And people like to play what we like. Now, Zeppelin and Pink Floyd were those kind of bands that the punk rockers and different people rebelled against, called them the old dinosaurs, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Well, there again, the people that were saying that at the time, where are they now? In the dustbin of history, nobody cares. Where's their No Quarter? Where's their Stairway to Heaven? Exactly. I don't care about that at all. I believe the band would have recognized the magic that they had. And, you know, maybe they would have said, look, side one is going to be Page and Bonham rocking out. Side two, you can do your goofy pop songs, John Paul Jones and Robert Plant. They might have struck some kind of compromise. They didn't seem like bitchy kind of guys. Yeah, they had artistic things in mind, but I couldn't see them like sniping in the way some of these other bands have done. I mean, you mentioned substance abuse problems, things like that. I mean, never mind the 80s. How would you describe like a 90s Led Zeppelin? What might that have looked like?
I really don't think I could. I really don't, because, you know, things have changed so much. An interesting thing about the 90s, I know very little about it because I'm stuck in the 60s and 70s. I'd be the first to admit that. But I do know about the 90s there was a sense of almost a rebellion against the 80s with the 90s bands. And I do appreciate the so-called grunge, some of the sort of anti-corporate mentality and being more authentic and real and getting back to real instruments and actually playing as a band as opposed to things being synthesized and programmed and all that sort of thing. Not that those elements disappeared completely, but my understanding of the 90s, there was a big element of that. So if anything, if Zeppelin had survived the 80s, they would have been able to probably thrive in the 90s because of those elements. One thing I will say about them continuing, however, had we not lost John Bonham, it might not have worked for another and more sad reason, and that is Robert Plant. The last few years of Zeppelin were very, very difficult for him personally. He had that near-death car accident. His wife almost died. He was severely hurt. Then his son dies mysteriously, and they cancel the remainder of a tour in '77. He flies home and is in seclusion, obviously, for a couple of years. And by then, as we said earlier, Page and Bonham in particular had substance abuse problems, and they were less reliable and not perhaps as focused, whereas Plant and Jones were clean for the most part. I think that them surviving as a band would have been difficult for Plant just because I think he was tiring of the whole thing. And it was, you know, in hindsight to him, it's got to be a lot of bad memories. And then, of course, it culminated with the death of his childhood friend, John Bonham. So had John not died, they might have gone on for a while. But, you know, I suspect that Plant would have finally broken down and wanted to do a solo album or something. And they had never done that before, none of the band members. So it's hard for me to speculate, but I think that would have been another factor.
Well, of course, Robert Plant did release music after Led Zeppelin, and maybe it's a good indicator of what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And don't forget, Page and Plant did come together on the No Quarter project, which I believe was in the 90s. I'm sure it was in the 90s. It was well received. At the time, not including John Paul Jones was perceived as a snub. But, you know, they explained that if they had done that, well, it was just going to be Zeppelin -1 and created a lot of, you know, perception problems for them. But, you know, I like that. What they did, they kind of did a recording. They did a little small audience concert. They reimagined some of their previous material in interesting ways. They did Since I've Been Loving You with a string section. They did Kashmir with Egyptian musicians. Try saying that, everybody at home. They did Kashmir with Egyptian musicians, you know, try and reinvigorate the old material. They also did some new material with that familiar world music band. I think they went to Morocco. You know, so in a way, I wouldn't call that a Zeppelin reunion or anything, and Bonham wasn't there. But you know, you mentioned grunge. Those grunge guys in Nirvana, they respected The Who, they respected Black Sabbath and Zeppelin, and they grew up on that stuff. And it's totally infused in that style. They respected it more than, let's say, the hair bands that we alluded to at the very beginning, Quiet Riot, Rat. I mean, grunge was a reaction to that. They said, look, we want to jam, we want to not rock out. We're not about hairspray and jewelry and bandanas, you know. But neither was Zeppelin, see?
Exactly.
And neither was The Who. You know, honestly, the first time I saw Nirvana, they were on some award show. They got to the end and they smashed up their instruments, and I go, it's been done. It was called The Who, you know. So to me, they're just the next generation of The Who. Well, you know, of course, another parallel with the Beatles is, you know, the Beatles broke up in 1970. Zeppelin broke up in 1980. But you never know it listening to the radio or watching the news. The Beatles come up all the time. Zeppelin has been coming up too. I mean, the O2 shows they did with Jason Bonham on drums that was released as a Celebration Day concert DVD comes to mind. You know, apparently that venue had millions of ticket requests when it was announced that they were playing there. And that just goes to show that in the 2000s, Zeppelin remains relevant and popular to this day. Another very visible development was the Kennedy Center honors, where they were recognized for their contributions to American culture, even though they're not Americans themselves. David Letterman was also coincidentally a recipient that evening, and this was before the Letterman show had gone off the air. So I guess backstage or something said, "You guys want to come on my show?" And they did. Did you happen to see that interview?
I own it. Yeah, I made a DVD of it. It's a great. John Paul Jones shows a side of him that people didn't know. He was very funny in that, and I loved that. I loved that Dave had them on there and took advantage of that because that might not come up again. So it was a great thing to do while they were together. The cries for them to have a full-scale reunion have just been deafening ever since the O2 Arena show. And I personally, as a hardcore Zeppelin fan, am completely against it. I actually hold to Robert Plant's view that, that's in the past. It's what it is, and it should be left alone. And the fact is, and you made allusion to this much earlier, when John Bonham died, that's the end of Led Zeppelin. It would have been the case for any of the four of them. They were that unique that no member could possibly be replaced. I mean, it's insulting to even think that. And at that time and subsequent to that, they made numerous references to that fact. It would have been ridiculous to try to carry on and have some other drummer playing John Bonham's parts or whatever. It bothers me that Page and Jones have been so open to that. I suppose one reason that people are slightly open to it is because it's Jason Bonham, Bonham's son, that would have been part of this reunion had they done a full-scale one. But the bottom line is, without John Bonham, it's not Led Zeppelin, period. It would be some facsimile, but it would never be Led Zeppelin. That is set in time and unique and what it is and should never be messed with, in my opinion. But again, I'm pretty hardcore about that.
Well, in my opinion, they've already done it. They did the concert, they made it on a DVD, and that's it. I mean, go watch that, and you've got it. That's what Zeppelin is like in 2007 or whatever year they did that.
Yeah.
And these people just want them to come to their hometown so they can see it live. Yeah. And Plant doesn't want to put himself through that. I mean, as you mentioned in your book, he was working with Alison Krauss and doing things that interested him personally. Jason Bonham is happy to step in. I mean, that poor guy. I mean, his dad died when he was very young. What do you do when it's like being Frank Sinatra Jr., it's like, what do you do when he's talented as Jason is? And I love hearing him play with them. I mean, if it has to be somebody, I'm glad it's him. Yeah. He has the same DNA, and he was taught by his dad how to play, and he's the closest you're going to come to having John Bonham up there. But it still isn't. It's like if everybody wants Julian Lennon and McCartney's kid and George Harrison's kid and Zach Starkey to form a band, so it can be all the kids of the Beatles. And they're like, why the hell would we want to do that? They don't think about it from their point of view. But yeah, just the thing about John Paul Jones, it was funny when they came out. He's like, Page and Plant sort of dropped in the chairs furthest away from Dave, and like John Paul Jones that was all that was left. So he sat closest to him. And yeah, I mean, a lot of it was funny, a lot of it's interesting, but the best part by far, Letterman asked him, "Oh, the Stones, did you work together? Did you run into them?" He asked him all these questions, and John Paul Jones just goes, "How many no's do you want?"
I know.
Classic line. I mean, how hilarious.
Like, he had that kind of sarcastic humor.
Yeah, it was like one of those joke grenades. He didn't mean it in a mean way. It was like a joke grenade. It got people to think when somebody asks you 8 questions at the same time and the answer to all of them is no, you want 8 no's? Will 2 do?
Yeah, people, if they want to see that, they could go to YouTube. I'm sure it's up there. If they haven't seen it, they really should check that out. It's really worth seeing. And you mentioned the Kennedy Center honors. I got to tell you, I'm sure I'm not alone with this. And in fact, Robert Plant shared this with me. I got really emotional watching that. I had tears coming to my eyes because it's just, it means so much to those Zeppelin fans like you and me. It meant so much to our youth. And it, there's always that longing when we get to a certain age. You reminisce, you think about your youth and what it meant to you and the things that were important at that time. And seeing that sort of honor for them was really powerful and emotional.
Yeah, and the President of the United States is there. And you saw him and his wife just kind of like, rocking their heads to Zeppelin music. They knew the music. They liked the music. Oh. And, pretty much all the people who commented and performed were good. Everybody talked about Heart primarily. And I think that the reason that main reason I think Robert Plant teared up during Stairway to Heaven was because everybody was wearing the John Bonham little bowler hat as a tribute to him, and they had no prior knowledge of any of it. So I think that was a big part of it. Well, I see that you dedicated this book to your father. What do you want to tell us about him?
Well, my father loved music, classical music primarily, though he said he liked all kinds of music, originally from West Virginia, so I think certainly some country music was in his background, but he loved classical music, had it playing in the house a lot when I was growing up, and I have developed a very significant love of classical music of my own here in my adult life because of that. But it's primarily because tragically my parents divorced when I was 14 in like 1978. My dad remarried, and so whenever I'd spend time with he and his new wife over the years up until his passing, he was always really supportive of any kind of artistic pursuits I had, whether it was music or other pursuits, writing and acting and so forth.
Painting?
And painting, drawing and painting. I have, because I didn't want to try to get the rights to Zeppelin pictures, I have the only Zeppelin pictures that are in my book are drawings and paintings I had done back in high school. So they show that I was young, but they're reflective of what I was trying to get across.
They're way better than I could do.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, my dad was very supportive of anything I pursued, and that meant a lot to me, and he passed away while I was doing the book. Before I was able to get it done, I know he would have been very proud of it, and so it was sad for me that he didn't get to read it, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledged that.
Your dad sounds like an awesome guy. I mean, my dad died in 2001, and I still miss him. And my biggest regret is he never got to meet my kids. They've seen pictures of him, and they kind of know who he is. But because you'd mentioned the emotion of watching Kennedy Center Honors, it reminded me of the dedication of your book. So speaking of your book, Back to School and What Led Zeppelin Taught Me About Music, I know it's for sale on Amazon because that's where I got it. Is that where you recommend everyone pick it up as their best option?
Yes, indeed. It's easily available. If they try to type it in based on back to school, and there'll be books that come up that are similar sounding, that are like school text and things. Mm-hmm. So the easiest way to find it is to simply type under the topic of books, type my name. That's Kevin and last name Courtright, Courtright, and it'll come up. And I appreciate very much being able to share that. The book, again, the core of the book is simply, this is what I learned from this particular band about music. And it's, I hope, is shown to be pretty comprehensive. But I was amazed when I started putting the book together and thinking it through and writing down what I wanted to do, how much I didn't know I'd learned that much until I started working on the book. I mentioned that in the preface, maybe in the introduction of the book, how much I learned from them. It's really amazes me. And so it just tells you what they have to offer. And I see the book as being something that I would hope that younger people today would perhaps want to take a look at, so they can get an understanding of how great that era was and what that band meant to so many of us, and why they are so legendary, because they deserve the legend they have.
All that's in the book, and as you said, it's also practical lessons. I mean, if you've been playing in a band for a year or two, yeah, you should think about rhythm sections and lyrics and presentation, and what about the business side of it? I mean, it's all in here. I mean, if I would have just started this out just by reading the chapter titles, that would have been intriguing enough. I mean, obviously, we went down the rabbit hole of our personal love for Led Zeppelin, and we didn't talk specifically about what's in the book as much as I would have liked to. But as soon as I picked it up and read all that, I go, I'm going to love this book. Because I said you're very thorough. I mean, there was really no aspect of the band that I could think of that wasn't mentioned in here. I mean, it does not need a sequel. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I think I said it all as much as I know. Without a doubt, yeah, it's fairly comprehensive, and I hope that young people out there today, and it should be hopefully for anybody, but especially young musicians, I think that they can learn something from Led Zeppelin through me.
Yeah, and I'm a guy, I picked up the band years and years ago, and I knew, I would hope people can tell I knew a lot about them, and I learned things from your book too, and I'm like a relative insider to this stuff. I mean, I've picked up the guitar and sat at the keyboards and played a lot of this music. I went to that damn movie a million times.
Yeah.
As I said before, there was something about Led Zeppelin that was more than just and my kids picked up on it with no prior warning. I just put it on, and you could just tell by looking at them. There's a quote-unquote presence, which is what that name means. I mean, somebody told the band that they had a presence. That wasn't just a silly name they came up with. There is a Led Zeppelin presence, and that's what that album title signifies. Ironically enough, or coincidentally enough, or maybe not so ironic and not so coincidental, our outgoing track here is from the Presence album. So, Kevin, I want to thank you not only for Skyping in today to talk about your book, but also for supporting this podcast for the past few years. I really appreciate both.
It's my pleasure, and I really appreciate you offering this opportunity for me. It means a lot to me, and I enjoyed it very much, and I do recommend your podcast. I think you're doing a great service.
Well, thanks for that. And as I said, we're going to close the show with a rollicking little number that shows off all 4 Led Zeppelin band members to great effect, and appropriately enough, it has "Last" in the title. We both mentioned this song earlier. This is from the Presence album. We're going to leave you with Achilles' Last Stand. So everybody, get the book, go listen to Led Zeppelin. Here's a head start for you, and we'll see you next time. So long, everybody.
I mean, to be in London when you guys were kids and all of the music going on and the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and the Beatles and the Who and, I mean, there's never been anything like that, has there?
Were there other bands? I don't remember.
But did you all know one another? Would you hang out? Would you visit? Would you gig with one another? Would you work on each other's music?
How many no's do you want?